My name is Sloan Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 12 years, I've served as a Chief Warrant Officer 3 with the U.S. Army, working as a construction engineering technician out of Fort Liberty, North Carolina. A job where you learn early on that the only thing more dangerous than a structural flaw is a person you're supposed to trust. I've spent my career building things that are meant to stand the test of time, but nothing prepared me for the moment I stood in a Pinehurst country club and watched my father project the words infertile, divorced, and military failure onto a 10-foot screen in front of 200 guests. As the room erupted in laughter, my sister, the bride, leaned into her microphone and told everyone not to laugh too hard because I might actually cry. But I didn't cry. I simply picked up my phone and typed one word: begin. The silence that followed was so heavy you could hear the ice cracking in my mother's wine glass as a different set of slides began to roll, dismantling 16 years of lies and a family reputation built on the back of my sacrifice. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let me take you back. The phone call that started it all came 4 weeks before the wedding, just as I was settling back into my office at Fort Liberty after a 9-month rotation in Eastern Europe. It was late on a Thursday, the kind of humid North Carolina evening where the air feels like a wet wool blanket, and I was staring at a set of structural blueprints for a new barracks project when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered to find the voice of a woman named Elena, a nurse at the Shenandoah Hills Care Center, who told me that my grandmother, Martha, was scheduled for hip replacement surgery in 3 weeks and was asking for me. My hand tightened around the receiver because the woman who raised me, a retired Army nurse herself, was the only person in that family who ever treated me like I was more than a disappointment to be managed. I hadn't seen her in 2 years. Not since my father, Arthur Mercer, had me removed from the approved visitor list after he found out I'd visited her without his permission. The nurse's voice dropped to a whisper as she told me that my father had given her instructions to tell me I could visit Grandma Martha, but only if I attended my sister's wedding first, a condition that felt like a knife to the ribs after a decade of silence. Then she added the warning that changed everything. My grandmother wanted me to know they were planning something for the reception, a public joke at my expense, and she wanted me to be ready. I looked up at the wall of my office where my CW3 promotion certificate hung beside my Army Commendation Medal, and I realized that after 5 years of total silence, the first communication from my family wasn't about love or pride in my service, but a calculated threat. To understand why they hated me enough to turn my medical history into a punchline, you have to go back 16 years to the night my father sat me down at our mahogany dining table and demanded I sign over a 2-acre parcel of land on the edge of Pinehurst. That land had been a gift from Grandma Martha on my 16th birthday, a legal transfer that was supposed to be my safety net, but my father wanted it for his Mercer Heights development project. When I refused to sign, he didn't just argue. He systematically dismantled my life, starting with the college tuition fund he'd been building since I was born. 1 week later, I was standing in the foyer with a single duffel bag and $43 in my checking account while my father told me that if I walked out that door, I was no longer a Mercer. My sister Cassidy, who was only 11 at the time, watched from the stairs as I left, her face already mirroring the cold indifference of our mother, Lydia. I spent the next 2 weeks sleeping in my car at a truck stop near Charlottesville before enlisting in the Army, seeing the GI Bill as my only path to the education my father had stolen. I spent my 20s in the dirt, learning to build bridges and airfields, eventually earning my master's in structural engineering while deploying to places my mother couldn't find on a map. Along the way, I married a man named Grant Sterling, a corporate consultant who turned out to be a shadow image of my father. Controlling, manipulative, and convinced that my career was a hobby. When we divorced at 27, I found out the hard way that I couldn't have children, a medical fact I processed alone in a military clinic while my unit was preparing for a field rotation. I never told my parents, but I suspect Grant kept in touch with them, providing the leverage my sister eventually used to craft her little slideshow. Now, at 34, I am a Chief Warrant Officer 3 and one of the lead construction engineering technicians for the Vance Defense contracting account at Fort Liberty, specifically tasked with the Fayetteville Veterans Center restoration. I didn't hide my success from my family because I was ashamed. I just stopped performing for people who had already decided I was a failure. The morning after the nurse called, I sat in my office and watched my friend, Master Sergeant Jax Novak, through the glass partition of the Signal Corps hub. Jax is a 36-year-old IT specialist and the most unflappable man I've ever served with. The kind of friend who doesn't ask why you need a favor, only when you need it done. I told him about the wedding, the ultimatum, and the warning from the nursing home, and he looked at me with that tired, knowing expression of a man who's seen too many combat deployments. He told me that if I was going into that room, I wasn't going in with hope. I was going in with a plan. And since he was the best comms tech in the 82nd Airborne, he'd make sure I had the tactical advantage. 3 weeks before the wedding, my father required a reconciliation dinner as a condition for clearing my name at the nursing home, so I drove the 2 hours to the Mercer estate in Pinehurst. The house was exactly as I remembered: white columns, a meticulously manicured lawn, and the performance of American respectability maintained with the precision of a military drill. My mother, Lydia, greeted me by telling me I looked hardened and asked if the Army was still paying for my haircut, a comment wrapped in the kind of faux concern she used to keep people small. At the table, my father assumed I was working as a clerk or a low-level mechanic, and I didn't correct him when he asked if I'd finally gotten the military out of my system. My sister arrived late, flashing a 4-carat diamond and complaining about the wedding florist, then pulled me aside to hand me a beige, shapeless dress that looked like a burlap sack, telling me I needed to blend in because her new in-laws were very particular about their social circles. The name of those in-laws hit me like a concussion grenade: the Vance family. Madeline Vance, the CEO of Vance Defense, was the primary benefactor of the Fayetteville project I was currently leading. She knew my work, she knew my technical specifications, and she knew me as CW3 Sloan Mercer. But she had never seen my face in person. As I drove back to Fort Liberty that night, I realized that I wasn't just a stranger to my family. I was the architect of the project that was about to make the Vance family the most powerful developers in the Sandhills region. I sat in my driveway for a long time, the engine of my truck ticking as it cooled in the humid night air, thinking about the folders on my desk back at the Fayetteville Veterans Center site office. My father had spent his entire life trying to climb into the inner circle of the Vance family, chasing their wealth and their influence like it was the only thing that could validate him. And yet he had no idea that I was already the one sitting at the table with Madeline Vance. I didn't plan to use that connection for a power play because I wasn't like him, but having that truth in my pocket felt like wearing a piece of body armor under my civilian clothes. The next morning, I met Jax Novak at a small diner just outside the gates of Fort Liberty, a place where the coffee is strong enough to wake the dead and the walls are covered in unit patches. I told him about the Vance connection and the way my sister had looked at me when she handed me that beige dress, and Jax just stirred his coffee, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. He told me that he'd already secured the freelance AV job for the reception at the Pinehurst Country Club because the local company was desperate for experienced technicians, especially ones who wouldn't flinch if a projector bulb blew. He said he was going to make sure that whatever my family had planned, they wouldn't be the ones holding the remote when the lights went down. For the next week, I worked my shifts at the Veterans Center, overseeing the structural reinforcement of the historic brickwork, and spent my nights in my home office with Jax, building a different kind of structure. I gathered my officer record brief, photos of me in full dress uniform, and images of the buildings I designed from the Pacific to Europe. I even included the commendation medal for my work on the multinational logistics hub during my last rotation. I wanted the truth to be so clear and so documented that it couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding. And as I looked at the slides, I realized for the first time that I had built a life I was actually proud of, despite everything they had tried to do to me. 6 days before the wedding, I finally got permission to see the woman who raised me, though my mother insisted on accompanying me to ensure I didn't upset the balance. Shenandoah Hills was a quiet, expensive-looking facility that smelled of lemon polish and hidden sadness. and my mother, Lydia, parked herself in a wingback chair in the hallway, already scrolling through her phone as if she were waiting for a hair appointment. I walked into the room to find Grandma Martha looking smaller than the last time I'd seen her, her white hair wispy like dandelion fluff, but her eyes were still as sharp as a sergeant major's. The moment I sat down, she grabbed my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm, her voice a low rasp as she told me she was proud of me for staying in the service. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small wrinkled envelope that she'd managed to hide from the staff, telling me that the nurse, Elena, had helped her keep it safe from my father's prying eyes. Inside was a photocopy of a property deed, and as I looked at the legal descriptions, I felt the air leave my lungs, because the 2-acre parcel of land my father had been using as a threat for 16 years was still legally mine. He had been telling everyone in Pinehurst that it was part of Mercer Properties, but he'd never actually managed to transfer the title because my signature was the only one that mattered. I looked at that piece of paper and felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me as I realized my father hadn't just thrown me out. He had been lying to the entire town and the Vance family about his own assets for over a decade. He was building his reputation on a foundation of sand, and he was terrified that I would be the one to point it out. I leaned down and kissed my grandmother's forehead, promising her that I wouldn't let them break me, and she just squeezed my hand and told me to be the officer she knew I was. I walked out of that room past my mother, who didn't even look up from her screen to ask how her own mother was doing, and I drove back to my house with the deed photocopy tucked into my deployment bag. I spent the rest of the evening with Jax, finalizing the timing of the presentation and ensuring the USB drive was encrypted so no one could mess with it before the reception. He told me that he'd already scoped out the country club's utility closet and found the power override, and he promised me that when the time came, he'd have the room locked down. That night, my father called me, his voice smooth and authoritative, the same tone he used when he was trying to close a land deal. He told me the rules for the wedding. I was to sit at table 14 in the back corner. I was not to speak to the Vance family unless they spoke to me first. And I was to tell everyone I worked as a receptionist at a small engineering firm if they asked. He reminded me that my grandmother's future care depended on my cooperation, a threat that would have made me tremble 5 years ago. But now it just made me feel a profound sense of disgust. I told him I understood the rules, and I hung up before he could say another word, knowing that the man who thought he was in control was about to walk into a room he didn't recognize. As the wedding day approached, the Pinehurst weather turned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect October day that my mother would have described as socially ideal. I spent the morning in my uniform, just for the feeling of it, before changing into a navy blue silk dress I'd bought myself in Europe, a sharp tailored piece that felt like a uniform in its own right. I left the beige burlap sack my mother had given me hanging in the back of my closet, and I drove toward the Pinehurst Community Church with the deed to that land and a decade of truth sitting in the passenger seat. The parking lot was a sea of luxury cars, a gathering of the local elite who had come to watch the Mercer and Vance families merge their empires. I sat in the back row of the church, a ghost in a navy dress, watching my father shake hands like a politician while my mother adjusted her pearls with a satisfied smile. My sister, the woman who was about to marry into the most powerful family in the county, walked down the aisle with a look of triumph that made my stomach turn, especially when she glanced toward the back of the room and saw me sitting there. She didn't see a sister, she saw a prop, a reminder of how much better she had done for herself than the one who had run off to the military. After the ceremony, we moved to the Pinehurst Country Club, where the reception was a blur of crystal chandeliers and forced laughter. And I found myself seated at table 14, right next to the kitchen door, where the smell of stale grease and the sound of clattering dishes never stopped. My table mates were distant cousins I hadn't seen in a decade, and an elderly couple who spent the entire dinner discussing their recent cruise, clearly instructed not to engage with the difficult daughter. From my seat in the corner, I watched my father leaning in close to Madeline Vance at the head table, his face flushed with the success of the merger, and I saw Jack standing near the AV booth in a black polo shirt, his eyes never leaving the room. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a performance of wealth that felt as fragile as glass, and as the lights began to dim for the special presentation, I felt my phone vibrate in my hand. It was a message from the group chat my sister had added me to earlier that week, a preview of the slideshow she had prepared, and as I scrolled through the images of me labeled as a dropout and a failure, I knew that the bridge my family had built was about to collapse. The Pinehurst Country Club ballroom was a masterpiece of selective memory, a room where the lighting was kept just dim enough to hide the cracks in the plaster and the history of the people standing within it. I sat at table 14, my back to the kitchen, watching the waitstaff weave through the tables with trays of sea bass and expensive champagne, while my sister, the bride, stood at the head table and beamed at the crowd. She looked exactly like the woman our mother had raised her to be. A person who understood that in this town, the appearance of happiness was far more valuable than the actual thing. Beside her, my father, Arthur Mercer, was deep in conversation with a local magistrate, his laughter loud and practiced, the sound of a man who believed he had finally consolidated everything he ever wanted, including my silence. The maid of honor stepped to the microphone, her voice amplified and echoing off the vaulted ceilings as she announced a tribute to the Mercer legacy. And I felt a cold, familiar stillness settle over me, the same kind of focus I used when I had to brief a colonel on a failing foundation or a blown budget. The screen behind the head table flickered to life, and for the first minutes, it was exactly what everyone expected. Soft piano music playing over photos of my sister as a child, her ballet recitals, her high school graduation, and the countless family vacations where I was conveniently cropped out of the frame. My mother, Lydia, leaned back in her chair, her face bathed in the glow of the projector, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips as she watched the polished version of our lives unfold for the most influential people in Moore County. I watched Madeline Vance sitting at the center table, her posture straight and her expression unreadable, and I wondered if she realized that the man sitting next to her, my father, was currently trying to sell her a partnership based on land he didn't even own. The music in the room shifted then, moving from a sentimental piano melody to something faster and more playful. A drum roll sound effect that made the guests lean forward in their seats. My sister took the microphone back, her grin widening as she told the room that they couldn't forget the other member of the family, the one who had taken a slightly different path than the rest of them. The first slide of me appeared, a photo from when I was 18, taken just days before I left for basic combat training at Fort Jackson. I looked exhausted, my hair pulled back in a messy knot, standing in our driveway with that old duffel bag. But the caption beneath it didn't mention the army or the sacrifice I was about to make. Instead, in bold, mocking letters, it read, "High School Dropout." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room, the kind of sound people make when they aren't sure if they're allowed to find something cruel funny, so they follow the lead of the person with the microphone. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, as the slides continued to roll like a slow-motion accident I had spent years preparing for. The next image was a candid shot of me from my first divorce hearing, my face gaunt and my eyes red, labeled simply as divorced, followed by a cartoonish image of an empty bank account with the word broke flashing in red. My father didn't look away. He watched the screen with a smirk, nodding slightly as if he were confirming a series of facts to the people at his table, making sure everyone knew that my absence from their lives wasn't his fault, but a result of my own perceived inadequacies. But the final slide was the one that made the air in the ballroom turn to ice. It was a medical form I had left in a drawer years ago, a document from a military doctor that I thought was private, and across the bottom of the screen, in letters 10 feet tall, was the word infertile. My sister leaned into the microphone, her voice dripping with a mock sweetness that made my skin crawl, and told the guests not to laugh too hard because I might actually cry. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just looked at the woman who was supposed to be my sister, and I saw a stranger who had decided that my private pain was the perfect entertainment for her wedding night. I looked at my mother, who was swirling her wine and looking at me with a pity that felt like a slap, and I looked at my father, who had already turned back to Madeline Vance to resume his talk about the Mercer Heights development. They thought they had finished me. They thought that by putting my medical history and my struggles on a screen, they had finally ensured I would never be able to hold my head up in this town again. But they had forgotten one thing. They had raised me to be a mercer, and then the army had taught me how to be an officer. I didn't need their permission to be whole, and I certainly didn't need their respect to tell the truth. Under the table, I pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, over the one word I'd typed into the message for Jax Novak. I looked toward the AV booth and saw the small red light of a signal processor blinking in the dark, a sign that Jax was ready and waiting for my signal. I thought about Grandma Martha in her bed at Shenandoah Hills, and I thought about the 12 years I had spent building a life while they were busy trying to bury the memory of me. I pressed begin. 3 seconds later, the projector didn't just flicker. It went completely black, the playful music cutting out with a harsh, digital snap that made several guests jump. My sister frowned, tapping the microphone and looking toward the back of the room, calling for the tech guy to fix the glitch so she could finish her toast. My father stood up, his face reddening as he prepared to bark an order, but before he could say a word, the screen hummed back to life. It wasn't the slideshow of my failures anymore. The first image was my Chief Warrant Officer 3 promotion photo, me in my Army service uniform, back straight and eyes clear, standing in front of the American flag. The caption didn't use a label, it just stated a fact. CW3, Sloan Mercer, 1-2, OA, Construction Engineering Technician, U.S. Army. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. A woman at a nearby table gasped, her hand going to her mouth as she realized the dropout she had been laughing at was a commissioned officer with over a decade of service. The slides didn't stop. They moved through my career with a clinical, undeniable precision. There was a photo of me on a job site in Poland wearing a Kevlar vest and a hard hat, standing in front of a reinforced concrete bridge I had designed for a multinational exercise. Then came the image of my master's degree from Virginia Tech, followed by the Army Commendation Medal I'd earned for my work on the Fayetteville Veterans Center, the very project my father had been bragging about as his own. I stood up from table 14. I didn't rush, and I didn't hide. I walked toward the center of the ballroom, the navy silk of my dress catching the light, and I watched my father's face turn a shade of gray that I will never forget. My mother was frozen, her glass halfway to her lips, and my sister was clutching the microphone so hard her knuckles were white. For the first time in 16 years, the room wasn't looking at the bride. They were looking at me, and they weren't laughing anymore. I looked at my father, the man who had tried to use my grandmother as a leash and my past as a weapon, and I realized that the only person in this room who had actually failed was him. He had spent his life building a reputation on the idea that I was nothing, and in less than 60 seconds, I had shown the entire town of Pinehurst that I was the only one in the family who had actually built something that mattered. The silence in the Pinehurst Country Club was no longer the uncomfortable, hushed laughter of people witnessing a family squabble. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a room that had just seen a mask ripped away. I stood in the center of the hardwood floor, the light from the chandeliers reflecting off the polished surface, and for the first time in 16 years, I didn't feel like the girl who had been thrown out into the rain with $43 to her name. I felt like the chief warrant officer I was, grounded, immovable, and entirely uninterested in the approval of people who used cruelty as a social currency. My father stood at the head table, his hands gripping the white linen cloth so hard his knuckles were a pale, sickly white. He looked at the screen, then at me, then at the guests who were now whispering and pointing, and I could see the frantic movement behind his eyes as he tried to find a way to pivot. He had spent decades perfecting the role of the successful Pinehurst developer and the doting father, and seeing his difficult daughter revealed as a high-ranking Army officer and the lead engineer on the town's most prestigious restoration project was a disaster he hadn't prepared for. My mother, the woman who had spent the evening telling me to blend into the walls, was now trying to hide behind her wine glass, her face a mask of frozen shock. She had spent years telling her book club that I was lost or finding myself in the military, a euphemism for the failure she believed I was. And now she had to sit there while the most powerful people in the county saw the medals and the degrees she had chosen to ignore. My sister Cassidy had finally dropped the microphone, the feedback whining through the speakers as it hit the floor, and she was looking at her new husband, Garrett, with a desperation that was almost pathetic. Have you ever been in a room where everyone finally sees the truth you've been carrying alone for years? If you've ever had to stand your ground when your own family tried to make you invisible, please hit that subscribe button. Now back to the story. Madeline Vance, the CEO of Vance Defense, was the first one to move. She didn't look at my father, and she didn't look at the bride. She pushed her chair back with a deliberate click and walked straight toward the center of the room. She was a woman who had built an empire in a world of men, and she recognized the army bearing in my posture before I even spoke. She stopped 3 feet from me, her eyes moving from my face to the screen where the Fayetteville Veterans Center blueprints were still visible. And she spoke in a voice that carried to the very back of the ballroom. CW3 Mercer, she said, her voice a flat, professional tone that silenced the remaining murmurs in the room. I've been reviewing your structural reports on the Veterans Center for 6 months, but I was under the impression that the Mercer involved in this project was merely a local liaison. She turned her head slowly, her gaze landing on my father like a searchlight. Your father told our board that he was the one coordinating the technical logistics. He never mentioned that his own daughter was the senior engineer holding the actual contract. The color drained from my father's face, leaving him looking aged and exposed under the bright ballroom lights. He stepped away from the head table, his voice cracking as he tried to find the words to explain why he had claimed my professional work as his own to secure a seat at the Vance table. Madeline, it's a family business, he stammered, his country club charm failing him for the first time in his life. We all contribute in our own way, and I just wanted to ensure the Vance family knew the Mercers were fully committed to the Sandhills community. You didn't contribute anything, I said, my voice steady and quiet, a stark contrast to his rising panic. You spent 16 years telling this town I was a dropout while I was earning a master's degree in the dirt of deployment zones. You didn't even know I was back in North Carolina until a nurse called me because you were using my grandmother's surgery as a way to force me into this room. I reached into the pocket of my navy dress and pulled out the photocopy of the property deeds that Grandma Martha had given me. This was the legal reality that underpinned all the lies, the one thing my father couldn't charm his way out of. I walked toward the head table and placed the paper directly in front of Madeline Vance, right next to her untouched glass of champagne. Since we're talking about the Mercer Heights development and the land consolidation my father promised you, I said, looking directly at the man who had thrown me out for refusing to sign this very document. I think you should know that the center 2-acre parcel, the one the entire project relies on for access, is still legally mine. My father has been representing this land as his own for 16 years, but he never had the title, and he never had my consent. The room went beyond silent. It became a vacuum. Madeline Vance picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the legal descriptions and the name Sloan Mercer printed clearly on the deed. She looked at my father, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to a cold, focused anger that made the guests at the nearby tables pull back in their chairs. Is this true, Arthur? She asked, using my father's full name for the first time, a signal of the distance she was placing between them. Did you bring my family into a multi-million-dollar partnership based on land you don't even own? Did you lie to our legal team about the consolidation of the Mercer holdings? My father didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked at my mother, who was now weeping silently into a cloth napkin, and he looked at my sister, who was trying to pull Garrett away toward the exit. But Garrett wasn't moving. He was looking at the screen, then at the deed in Madeline's hand, and he looked at his bride with a look of pure, unadulterated realization. He had married into what he thought was the premier family of Pinehurst, only to find out he had joined a house built on fraud and the public humiliation of its own blood. I stood there, watching the empire my father had built on the back of my silence begin to splinter. He had tried to use my homecoming as a way to finalize his last great lie, turning my return from Fort Liberty into a prop for his social standing. But he had forgotten that you can't build a stable structure on a foundation of betrayal. The air in the Pinehurst Country Club seemed to thin, leaving only the sound of Madeline Vance tapping her fingernail against the edge of the deed I'd placed before her. My father, the man who had always prided himself on having the loudest voice in any room, was suddenly a ghost of his former self, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a narrative that could save him from the absolute truth of that document. He looked at the surrounding tables, at the men he'd played golf with for 30 years, and the women who had admired my mother's resilience in the face of her wayward daughter. And he saw nothing but a wall of judgment that was closing in on him. I stood my ground, my posture as rigid as it had been during a brigade inspection, feeling the eyes of the Fayetteville elite boring into me, while the father I once feared shrunk into the upholstery of his expensive chair. My sister finally broke the silence, her voice a shrill, frantic sound that cut through the tension like a jagged blade, as she screamed that I was ruining her wedding on purpose, that I had always been jealous of her happiness, and that I was faking everything just to get back at them for the life I'd chosen. She looked at Garrett, her eyes wide and wet with the kind of performative tears she'd used to get her way since she was a toddler, begging him to tell the security guards to throw me out so she could have her first dance in the ballroom she'd spent 18 months obsessing over. But her husband didn't move toward her. He stayed exactly where he was, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he looked at the screen behind us, which was still displaying my Army service record, showing every medal, every certification, and every year of service they had tried to erase. I didn't fake my master's degree, and I didn't fake the 9 months I spent in a freezing shipping container in Eastern Europe while you were choosing centerpieces and complaining about the color of the napkins, I said, my voice carrying the calm, steady weight of a person who no longer had anything to lose. I'm not here to take your night away, but I'm done letting you use my life as the setup for a joke you tell, to feel better about yourselves while I'm out there actually doing the work you're too afraid to even acknowledge. I thought about the nights I'd spent in the motor pool at Fort Liberty, the grease under my fingernails, and the weight of a rucksack on my back. All of it done so I could have a life that didn't require my father's signature or my mother's permission. Madeline Vance stood up then, her presence so commanding that the room seemed to tilt in her direction, and she didn't even look at my sister as she handed the deed back to me with a slow, deliberate nod. She turned her gaze to my father, her eyes narrowing with a cold, professional disappointment that was far more devastating than any shout or public scene could have been in a place like Pinehurst. She told him that the Vance defense legal team would be in touch by Monday morning to discuss the misrepresentations in the Mercer Heights contract, and that her family would no longer be moving forward with the partnership, effectively ending the legacy my father had sacrificed his integrity to build. The sound that came out of my mother then was a low, strangled sob, not for the daughter she'd lost or the years of silence she'd enforced, but for the social standing that was evaporating in front of her eyes as her most prestigious guests began to reach for their coats. She looked at me with a look that was so raw it was almost honest, accusing me of destroying everything they had built with my selfishness. But I just looked back at her and realized that she had never built anything at all. She had only ever maintained an image while I was out building actual foundations. I felt the weight of every missed birthday and every holiday spent in a barracks or a deployment tent, realizing that the sacrifice I'd already paid for my independence was finally being settled in full, right here in this ballroom. I watched as Garrett finally spoke, his voice low and heavy with a realization that seemed to age him 10 years in a single moment as he looked at my sister and told her that he had believed her when she said I was unstable. He said he had felt sorry for the Mercer family for having to deal with such a difficult child. But now he realized that he didn't know the woman he'd just married at all, and he certainly didn't recognize the family he'd just joined. He walked away from the head table, heading toward the bar without looking back, leaving my sister standing alone in her white dress, surrounded by the expensive lilies and the wilting laughter of a town that was already mentally rewriting the story of the Mercer family. I turned away from them then, walking back toward the kitchen door where Jack Novak was waiting, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with a quiet pride that meant more to me than any citation I'd ever been pinned with by a general. I didn't need to stay for the rest of the collapse because I knew how these things went. Once the structural integrity of a lie is compromised, the whole thing comes down, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the dust and the truth. I could see the guests whispering, their heads huddled together as they recalculated their associations with my parents, knowing that by tomorrow morning, the Mercer name would be a warning rather than a brand in the sandhills. As I walked out of the ballroom, I could hear my father trying one last time to call after Madeline, his voice small and desperate, the sound of a man begging for a reprieve from the very world he'd tried to exclude me from for 16 years. I walked out into the cool North Carolina night, the smell of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. And I felt the tension I'd been carrying since I was 18 finally lift from my shoulders, replaced by the cool, hard certainty of a mission accomplished. I was a Chief Warrant Officer 3 in the U.S. Army. I was the lead engineer on a multi-million-dollar restoration project. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly who I was supposed to be without needing a single person in that room to agree with me. I sat in the front seat of my truck, my hands steady on the steering wheel as I looked at the shadow of the Pinehurst Country Club in the rearview mirror, a monument to a life I no longer had to pretend to want. I thought about Grandma Martha in her bed at Shenandoah Hills, and I knew that when I visited her on Sunday, I wouldn't have to be the secret she kept under her pillow or the daughter who ran away. I would be the woman who stayed, the one who built her own house on the truth, and I would tell her every detail of the moment the screen lit up and the lies finally stopped working. The dashboard lights of my truck cast a soft green glow over the interior, illuminating the dust on the vents and the small Army Challenge coin I keep in the center console. Beside me, Jack Novak sat in silence, his large frame filling the passenger seat as he stared out at the front entrance of the Pinehurst Country Club. We watched as the first wave of guests began to filter out, men in tuxedos looking at their shoes and women in evening gowns clutching their wraps as if they were suddenly cold. In a town like Pinehurst, gossip is the only thing that moves faster than a golf cart. And I knew that by the time these people reached their driveways, the story of the Mercer wedding would have already been rewritten 10 different ways. "You did the right thing, Sloan," Jack said, his voice low and steady, the same tone he used when he was talking me through a structural failure on a job site. He didn't use words like victory or defeat, because in the military, we know that even the most necessary actions come with a cost. He just handed me a lukewarm coffee from the cup holder and waited for me to breathe. I looked at my hands, still resting on the steering wheel, and noticed they were finally still after years of a quiet, internal tremor I'd never been able to shake. I thought about the 9 months I just spent in Eastern Europe, missing my grandmother's 84th birthday and the funeral of a mentor because the Army needed me at a logistics hub 6,000 miles away. While I was sacrificing my time and my safety for a sense of duty, my father was sitting in his Pinehurst office, trying to figure out how to steal the only thing I had left of my childhood home. It wasn't just a betrayal of family, it was a betrayal of the very values he pretended to uphold every time he stood for the national anthem at a local football game. The following Monday, the Sandhills region began to rearrange itself around the wreckage of the reception. I was back at my desk at Fort Liberty, surrounded by the comforting smell of blueprints and industrial coffee, when I heard the first reports of the fallout. My mother, who had spent decades as the unofficial queen of the Pinehurst Garden Club, received a polite but final email informing her that her services were no longer needed on the Autumn Gala Committee. There was no mention of the wedding or the slideshow, just a brief note about organizational restructuring, the kind of social execution that is common in the upper circles of North Carolina society. My father's situation was much more dire. Madeline Vance was not a woman who made empty threats, and by Tuesday afternoon, her legal team had already begun the process of auditing every document my father had ever submitted to Vance Defense Contracting. The Mercer Heights project, which was supposed to be his crowning achievement, was effectively frozen. I heard from a contact at the county clerk's office that the investors were pulling out one by one, terrified of being associated with a developer who lied about his land holdings to the most powerful family in the state. Have you ever had to watch someone you loved face the consequences of a choice they made, knowing you couldn't save them even if you wanted to? If you've ever had to find the strength to stay quiet while the truth did the work for you, let me know in the comments. Now back to the story. In the middle of the week, I was out at the Fayetteville Veterans Center site, wearing my boots and my reflective vest, when a familiar black sedan pulled up to the gate. Madeline Vance stepped out, her expression as unreadable as it had been in the ballroom, and she walked toward the scaffolding where I was inspecting the foundation work. She didn't apologize for the wedding, and she didn't ask me how I was feeling. She just looked at the progress on the historic brickwork and told me that she appreciated the way I handled the unforeseen variables at the reception. She informed me that her foundation was moving forward with the restoration project, but they were officially severing all ties with Mercer Properties. She told me that she values the integrity of the work over the pedigree of the worker, and as she looked at the Veterans Center, she said she finally understood why I was the only one who could get the job done right. Before she left, she asked me what I intended to do with my 2-acre parcel. And I told her that for the first time in 16 years, I wasn't in any rush to decide. It was my land, and it would be there when I was ready. My phone buzzed constantly that week, mostly with messages from my sister, whose marriage to Garrett was already under a strain that no amount of wedding gifts could fix. She blamed me for the fact that her new husband was sleeping in his parents' guest house, and she accused me of poisoning the Vance family against her. I didn't respond to the accusations or the pleading. I just kept my phone in my desk drawer and focused on the load-bearing walls of the Fayetteville project. I realized that my sister had inherited my mother's habit of seeing herself as the center of every story, but she had never learned how to be the hero of her own. The most difficult call came on Thursday night. It was my father, his voice sounding thinner and more human than I had ever heard it. He didn't start with a demand or a rule. He simply asked me if I was happy now that I'd ruined everything he'd spent 40 years building. I told him that I hadn't built the slideshow, and I hadn't forged the documents, and I hadn't lied to Madeline Vance. I told him that he was the architect of his own collapse, and that I was just the one who refused to let the building fall on me. "You were always so stubborn, Sloan," he said. And for a second, I thought I heard a flicker of the man who used to take me fishing before the land and the money became his only gods. "I learned that from you, Dad," I replied, and the line went quiet. It was the first time I'd called him that in a decade, and it felt like a final goodbye to the version of him I'd kept alive in my head. I realized that the man on the other end of the phone wasn't a monster. He was just a person who had made a series of small, cruel decisions until there was no room left for anything else. I sat in my living room in Fayetteville, looking at the OER I'd just received from my CO, which praised my leadership and technical expertise under pressure. I thought about the difference between the respect I'd earned in the Army and the respectability my family had tried to force me into. One was a foundation built on rock. The other was a facade built on nothing but the fear of what the neighbors would think. I realized that the reason I could stand so tall in that ballroom wasn't because I wanted to hurt them, but because I finally knew that their opinion of me was the least interesting thing about my life. The following Sunday, I drove back toward Pinehurst, but I didn't turn onto the winding, manicured road that led to my parents' gated community. Instead, I drove straight to Shenandoah Hills, my truck windows down to let in the smell of wood smoke and the cooling North Carolina air. I didn't call my father to ask for permission, and I didn't check with my mother to see if it was a convenient time for her social calendar. I simply walked through the front doors, signed the visitor log as CW3 Sloan Mercer, and walked toward the sunroom where the nurse, Elena, told me I'd find the woman who actually raised me. Grandma Martha was sitting by the large bay window, a patchwork quilt draped over her knees, watching a pair of blue jays fight over a feeder on the lawn. She looked up as I approached, and the smile that broke across her face was the first piece of genuine warmth I'd felt in that town for over a decade. She didn't ask me about the wedding drama or the social standing of the Mercer family. She reached out, took my hand in hers, and told me that she'd heard every word of what happened at the reception. One of the younger staff members had shown her a video someone had posted to a Fayetteville community group, a grainy clip of the 10-foot screen, and the moment the Vance family realized who I really was. "You stood up, Sloan," my grandmother whispered, her fingers squeezing mine with a strength that surprised me. In a room full of people who spent years trying to make you feel like a ghost, you stood up and reminded them that you have a name. We sat there for 2 hours, and for the first time, I told her the truth about my life in the Army. I told her about the construction engineering projects I'd led in Germany and the airfield repairs I'd supervised in the high desert. I told her about the master's degree I'd earned while working 12-hour shifts and the way the chief warrant officer community had become the family I thought I'd lost when I was 18. She listened to every word, her eyes bright with the kind of pride that my mother had only ever reserved for my sister's social achievements. My grandmother, who had served as an army nurse during a time when women in the military were even more of a rarity, understood the sacrifice I'd paid. She knew that my service wasn't an escape or a failure to launch, as my father liked to frame it. It was the foundation of the person I had become. Before I left, she told me that the 2-acre parcel of land was my reward for being the only one in the family who didn't let the Mercer name become a cage. She told me she had kept that deed in her name for 16 years specifically because she knew my father would try to take it, and she knew I was the only one strong enough to hold onto it. By the time I left the nursing home, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the sandhills. My phone buzzed in the cup holder as I pulled out of the parking lot. A text from my sister, Cassidy. It wasn't an apology. It was a picture of a packed suitcase and a message telling me that Garrett was officially moving out and that it was my fault the perfect life she'd planned was coming apart at the seams. I didn't feel the surge of guilt she was trying to trigger. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion for her. She was 27 years old, and she still didn't understand that you can't build a marriage on the humiliation of your own sister. On Monday morning, I was back at the Fayetteville Veterans Center, standing in the center of what would soon be the main hall, reviewing the HVAC ducting layouts with my team. The building was a hive of activity, the sound of saws and hammers creating a rhythm that I found more peaceful than any wedding music. My commander from the engineering brigade at Fort Liberty stopped by the site around noon, not to check on the progress, but to hand me a formal letter from Vance Defense. Madeline Vance had officially requested that I remain the lead technical officer on all their upcoming regional restoration projects, regardless of whether Mercer Properties was involved or not. It was a professional endorsement that carried more weight than any local political connection my father had ever tried to leverage. I realized that by refusing to be the victim in that ballroom, I hadn't just saved my reputation. I had solidified my career in a way that made me completely untouchable by my father's influence. That evening, I finally drove past the old house in Pinehurst. I didn't stop, but I saw my mother standing on the front porch, her arms crossed as she watched a local real estate agent hammer a "coming soon" sign into the edge of the lawn. The Mercer Heights collapse had hit my father's liquidity hard, and the rumors in the Signal Corps hub were that he was having to sell off several of his personal holdings to cover the losses from the Vance partnership. For a second, I thought about pulling over, about offering some kind of comfort to the woman who had watched me walk away with a duffel bag and $43. But then I remembered the way she'd swirled her wine while the word infertile glowed on that screen, and I realized that my mother wasn't mourning a daughter. She was mourning a house and a neighborhood that would no longer look at her with the same admiration. I kept driving, my eyes on the road ahead, realizing that the bridge back to that house hadn't just been burned. It had been dismantled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to cross. I spent the rest of the night in my home office, looking at a new set of blueprints I'd started sketching for the 2-acre parcel. I didn't want to build a development or a monument to my success. I wanted to build a small, simple house for Grandma Martha, a place where she could sit on a porch and watch the creek without having to worry about who was on the visitor list. I realized that for the first time in 16 years, I wasn't building something for the Army or for a client or to prove a point to a father who would never listen. I was building something for the only person who had ever truly seen me. As I sat there, the quiet of the Fayetteville night outside my window, I felt a sense of peace that was so deep, it was almost foreign. I was C.W. Sloan Mercer, a construction engineering technician, a survivor of a family that tried to turn my pain into a punchline, and a woman who finally knew exactly where she belonged. 3 months after that night in Pinehurst, the dust has finally settled, but the landscape of my life looks entirely different than the one I left behind when I first deployed to Eastern Europe. I spent my Monday morning at Fort Liberty, finalizing the structural safety reports for the barracks renovation before driving back toward the town that once tried to erase me. I wasn't going to a wedding this time. I was going to the Pinehurst Town Hall to present the final designs for the Vance Heritage Restoration Project. As I walked into the council chamber, I saw the same faces that had been in that ballroom. The business owners, the local politicians, the people who had laughed at the slideshow. But this time, they weren't looking at a dropout. They were looking at the lead engineer holding the keys to the town's economic future. Madeline Vance stood at the front of the room, her presence as sharp and undeniable as ever, and she introduced me to the council as the most capable construction technician she'd ever hired. I stood at the podium and laid out my blueprints, explaining the load-bearing reinforcements and the architectural preservation of the old textile mill, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I didn't mention my family, and I didn't acknowledge the whispers in the back of the room. I just did my job. And for the first time, that was more than enough. When I finished, the council didn't just approve the plans, they stood and shook my hand, finally seeing the CW3 in the civilian blazer instead of the daughter who had been cast out. My father wasn't in the room. I heard through Jack Novak that the Mercer Heights project had completely collapsed after the Vance family pulled their funding, leaving my father with a series of lawsuits and a reputation that was no longer worth the paper it was printed on. He hasn't called me since that Thursday night, and I've realized that the silence is actually a gift, a quiet space where his expectations no longer have the power to weigh me down. My mother sent a single text message 2 weeks ago, an apology that consisted of only 2 words, and while I read it, I haven't felt the need to respond yet. I'm learning that forgiveness doesn't always mean letting someone back into the room where they hurt you. My sister, however, has started to reach out in a way that feels different, stripped of the performative cruelty she learned from our parents. Garrett moved back into their home last month on the condition that they attend intensive couples counseling. And from what Elena tells me at the nursing home, my sister has been visiting Grandma Martha once a week. She brings flowers and sits in silence, listening to my grandmother talk about the army and the life I've built. And while we aren't reconciled, we are no longer at war. She is finally having to figure out who she is without me as the punchline to her jokes. And for her, that might be the hardest work she's ever done. The best part of this new chapter, though, is the 2-acre parcel of land on the edge of Pinehurst. Last week, I broke ground on a small 1-story ranch house designed specifically for Grandma Martha, featuring a wide porch and a ramped entrance that will make her feel like she's finally home. I've been out there every weekend with Jax, laying the foundation footings and ensuring the structural integrity is perfect, because this is the most important building I'll ever create. I'm not building it to spite my father or to prove a point to the neighbors. I'm building it because my grandmother was the only one who believed I was worth saving, and now I have the skills to save a piece of her world in return. I visited her yesterday, and we sat on the patio at Shenandoah Hills as she practiced walking with her new hip, her progress faster than the doctors expected. She looked at me and asked if I was still carrying the labels my sister had put on the screen that night: the infertile, the failure, the dropout. I looked at my hands, the hands of a warrant officer who has built things meant to last for centuries, and I realized that those words no longer have a place in my vocabulary. I'm a woman who chose a different kind of legacy, one built on honor, technical excellence, and the kind of resilience you can only learn by surviving the people who were supposed to love you. As I drive back to Fayetteville tonight, the mountains are a deep, bruised purple against the orange sky, and the air smells like the beginning of winter. I don't feel like a ghost in my own life anymore, and I don't feel like I'm sitting at the back of anyone's table. I'm driving toward a home I bought with my own salary, a career I earned with my own sweat, and a future that is entirely of my own design. They called me many things in that ballroom, but they forgot the one title that actually matters. I am Sloan Mercer, and I am finally the architect of my own life. Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story isn't just about a wedding or a slideshow. It's about the moment you realize that your family's permission is the one thing you never actually needed to be whole. I'll see you in the next one.